Hi guys, and welcome to this Men's Wealth Table Talk on mental health. I've been envisioning a day like this for so long, where I get to sit with experts around the table and speak to you guys about mental health and just dive a bit deeper into the aspects of mental health, and also just digging deeper into how men struggle with mental health and why they struggle with mental health. So, moving on to that, Dr. Sergey, I want to ask you. So one of the things that I'm very passionate about is on the Heart of Man podcast that I have as well on Men's Wealth, is I always ask the question on the relationship that whoever I interview, what his relationship with his dad was. Because I really see that there's so many men that has had bad experiences, bad relationships with their dads, and I honestly believe that the way they do stuff today in their marriages, how they treat their kids in their businesses, that's got a direct impact on the way that they was raised, or also on the way that they had a relationship with their dad. So getting back to specifically on mental health. So is there anything from a biblical point of view, just the importance of the role that the father plays in any boy's heart and in his life?
Yeah, so I think starting on the macro scale, obviously the whole story of Scripture is relational. It's weaved into the whole essence of Scripture, particularly the relationship with God. And God Himself, being a Trinity, is a relationship. It's the example that we are called to strive towards and to understand, particularly the relationship between Jesus and the Father. He used words like, I and the Father are one. I do not say anything except what the Father tells me to say, or I don't do anything without knowing what the Father wants me to do, which talks about intimacy. So Scripture shows us that there's this intimacy between Jesus and the Father. And that leads us then into the redemptive story of our failures and our brokenness because of what the Bible calls sin can now be redeemed. It can be brought back into right alignment with God, not by our own effort necessarily, but because of what Christ has done. And that's the gospel. The essence of the gospel is a reconciliation between humankind and God to bring the two together. And Jesus is the one that has his hand on the Father and the hand on us. But the story doesn't stop there. He also gives us his Holy Spirit. And Paul describes to us in Romans 8, where he says, he's given us the Spirit by whom we say, Abba, Father. So now we can know and understand God as a father. The version that we can maybe use in our modern day setting is Papa for Abba. Abba is the intimate name for a father. So Papa. And when we are in communion and in communication with God, we can experience that intimacy. And that then opens us up to receive love. Because the biblical antidote for anxiety and fear is love. It's to receive love and to give love. And that starts with the Father. Because the Father plays an incredibly important role in the lives of children in terms of specifically definition. Fathers define who their children are. And God takes that role very seriously. As a matter of fact, in Malachi, he says that a part of what he wants to do is restore the relationship of the father to the children and the children back to the father. He doesn't even mention mothers. It's because usually mothers and children have a good relationship. But there's an issue with fathers and children. And the Lord says, he warns, he says, if that doesn't happen, then something spiritual will happen in the land. You know? And in society, what we see that the brokenness that we experience is a fatherlessness. There's an epidemic of fatherlessness. Either present fathers that are emotionally absent, or fathers that are just absent. So I think Scripture brings us back to that. It's a relationship with God. It's an intimate relationship with God. And from that primary relationship, you and I now can have an intimate relationship with one another. So it's the vertical and the horizontal. A restored relationship here can lead ultimately to a restored relationship, which is the cross.
Then maybe just on your side, in your practice, the men that you see, do you ever pick up that they had some troubles in their relationship with their dads?
It's a very psychological classic that men often project their own pathology because of the dynamic that they had with their father. So it doesn't have to be an absent father, but it can be an overbearing father, or it can be an aggressive father, or it can just be a really good father, or maybe it can be a really weak father. So in all our lives, the relationship we have with our fathers, on some level, influence the dynamic of our development. Interesting that there seems to be, research says that there's an entire generation of men that have been raised by women because of the absence of fathers. And it seems to be that these guys that have been raised by women understand women really well, so they end up being really good husbands. They're not necessarily being excellent men in terms of their identity. So they're seeking and they're lacking in that. But they seem to be really good husbands because they just get women. They just understand what the girls need because they were raised by their aunts and their grandmothers and their mothers. So there's some good news in all of the bad. So I think for modern day fathers, there's huge pressure. I see many men who have kind of awakened to the fact that they need to be better than what their dads were, and luckily,
can I stop you there? How? So for me, I'm a husband, I'm a father. I went through a similar experience with my dad, not a good experience. How do I improve that? Because I think that's a question a lot of men has. They've got this issue, they want to change. How do they do that? How do they improve on that?
You need to equip yourself. You need to, if you're not a reader, you need to start reading. You need to educate yourself. You need to develop. You need to challenge the dark side of your upbringing. You need to have a better understanding of who you are as a person. Go do a personality analysis. Find your own strengths. We can't all be the same. We're not good at everything. So for me, the best tool is to equip yourself with knowledge, and then to hold yourself accountable to actually just get it done. Show up, at the very least. Show up. That's why the 3 times 8 principle is so important. Force yourself to be there, to actually raise your child as best you can. Be in partnership with the person who's doing it with you, because that usually brings some accountability in terms of our flawed masculinity. But then to realize you have to figure out who you want to be. And for that, you have to do some work. You have to do a few courses, maybe go see a therapist, for a month or 2, and just do the homework. Or longer. Some of them do it for longer. It's amazing. If you've been in practice as long as I've been, I see people for a few sessions, and then 4 or 5 years will go by. And then they pop back onto the radar, and they'll say, I've become a father now, or my kids are teenagers. I have no idea what I'm doing. So that's that's good.
Johan, look, I think the first thing is in practical terms is actually showing up and being there. I looked at some research studies to get a kind of an idea of what the research has been showing around fathers and their involvement in the lives of kids. And basically everything is better, if I can summarize the research. So less destructive behavior, better self-esteem, better self-image, better problem-solving skills, better social abilities, more resilience. I have not seen a single study that says that there was a negative impact for fathers being more present and trying, you know. What I personally believe is that a father has a lot of impact on two places: providing security and making everyone in the house feel safe. And I think if a father can be committed to making it an emotionally safe space as well, so to say there is space for everybody's emotions here, and we don't have to hide it, or we can be anxious and I'm here with you, it's very powerful. And I think the other very powerful tool that a father has is speaking identity into kids. I think a mommy can tell you 1,000,000 times that you are beautiful and strong and amazing and clever, and it just doesn't land the same way as when your dad tells you that, you know. That being said, practically, I think one of the difficult things we have to address, and that I see very often in my work with children, or assessments, and then dad's coming into the office and then you say, I think you need a little bit help here, or let's refer to occupational therapy, and dad says, no, it's not necessary. I was like that when I was small. Look at me, I'm fine now, you know? Or no, we're not doing that, or we're not doing medication. I don't need that. Or it's fine if I hit my kid all the time. I was hit all the time. I'm fine, you know? And so we're not preaching that thing about, or talking about this idea that maybe you're not that fine. Maybe you can't just repeat everything in the way that it was done in your house. Maybe you should think a little bit and read a little bit and educate yourself a little bit and challenge some of that, like you said, that upbringing.
And speak to other men, you know. Men have this tendency to speak to each other about things that are easy. And there are very few situations, forums where men actually can speak openly about things that they feel unsure about, and where they can be held accountable, where a friend can pitch at your house and say, hey, I think you're drinking too much, or hey, I think you've gained a lot of weight, I think you're unhealthy, or oh, do you have to be so angry all the time? You know, men don't really challenge each other with those things, just because I don't think we're used to it.
And it's hard. It's easier to talk about rugby.
It is. But as you say, when it you know, I try not to sound sexist because I'm not, but when a dad says something, it definitely has a different impact on the lives of children. Especially if it is spoken from a place of stability and wisdom and calmness. But you can only do that if you figured yourself out.
Correct.
You know, if you're a lost soul, if you're still the incredibly broken vessel, which we all are, you know, some of us have just done a little bit of restoration in the meantime. But the brokenness is just handed to the next generation if you don't fix it. Which is just awful. It is so damaging. And I agree with you. Dads will often say, no, man, it worked in my life like that, they'll be fine. And then sometimes, you know, you just have to be brave enough to say, I don't think it will be fine for them. Maybe it was fine for you.
You recommended reading, and there's an amazing book that I came across which is called I Don't Want to Talk About It. I don't know if anyone's heard about it. It's by Terence Real, and the subtitle is Overcoming the Secret Legacy of Male Depression. For me, it was an incredible resource. And he's a psychologist, and he speaks about the literature, but also he tells very riveting stories about, patients he's seen. And then also his personal experience, struggling with depression and then being the son of a father that was depressed and also violent. So I think that maybe if someone is looking for a resource, that would be a good place to go. I definitely learned a lot from that book. And then I loved, Corinne, what you said about holding space for emotions. That really landed for me. It felt true. So thank you for sharing that.
And Johan, you also mentioned an important principle, and that's accountability. Sergey, maybe just from your side, how important as men is it to be accountable to someone?
I would say incredibly important, Johan. I think with the previous question that Johan addressed so eloquently, for me it's been a journey of awareness, acceptance, and incremental growth. So it is coming in tune with what I'm doing is having bad results and recognizing that. Because even though my generation grew up saying that I will never be like my dad, I find myself being like my dad.
Well, that happens if you do nothing. If you do nothing, then everything stays the same.
And there is this part that it's a little bit like an onion. It's one layer after the other. That's my journey. But there's improvement. So, and for that, I'm very thankful for. So to come back to what you were saying, and the question that you were asking was? Accountability. I think that personally in my life, that's been incredibly important, especially as a pastor. I believe every pastor should have a pastor. And it should be a safe space where you can share the deeper stuff that you struggle with, because you're in a leadership position where everybody else is looking up to you. You can't share vulnerably with everybody. Or even if it's a leader of an organization, you need a place where you can be vulnerable and where you can be honest with the stuff that you are dealing with. And attached to that is the accountability aspect, which actually should happen in a church context, where, as Johan expressed, where you have friends and brothers, for that matter, where we can be accountable with each other. Now, you can't be accountable to everybody, but in the context of where you have opened your life to certain men, you can be. And I think it's safety to do it that way. So even from a biblical point of view, I believe it is a necessary element that we need to build into our system as men. We almost need to be intentional about it, because I don't think we do it naturally. I would rather face my own issues and demons and try and deal with them. But then I deal with them in very unhealthy ways. Or I find myself dealing with. We talked about alcohol early on, and I know we're going to come back to that. Not that that was my issue, but there's also social media. Men can dissociate so easily and so readily. You come home, you've just had a hard day, you just want to relax, you want to switch off. But then you switch off from the family.
So, but there's something that I think is important for us to remember when we talk about accountability, especially in a church context. I think men are scared of accountability because they think of accountability as this idea of, I'm going to go really strong, then I'm going to fail, and then somehow I have to go tail between the legs to one of my friends and in shame admit what I've done wrong. Then I'm going to be politely patted on the back, encouraged to do something, but judged in secret, And we miss the part where accountability is not me coming to be shamed. Accountability is not me telling everybody about all my failures or having to completely expose myself. Because I think what then prevents men from being accountable is shame. But if we really want to change, we need to be vulnerable. There's no change without vulnerability. And if accountability can be reframed to this idea of this is a safe space where you can be vulnerable and you can tell me how hard it is. And I'm going to say, I'm here with you. It's hard for me too. Then accountability starts to look a little bit different. And the focus is more on that vulnerability aspect and kind of like being in it together than it is me coming to report my failure because I have an accountability partner.
Sure, I think we have to be mindful that we have to open the door in a safe space. We kind of have to gently be guided into accountability. Create some kind of group where men have a perfectly valid and non-threatening excuse to pitch up for. I met you in such a context where I thought there were going to be 5 men and I was going to quickly chat to them on a Friday morning in my running clothes, and I pitched and there were like 50 guys.
50 guys.
And they just all arrived, and it seemed a pretty safe space because there were many, and there was somebody saying something and they could partake, but it was not directed at them. And then from that connection, accountability kind of flowed. So I think it's really important that we create something that is just applicable to the time that we live in. People are busy. How are we going to create some kind of an awareness that there is a space where you can kind of pitch without a reason? It's like belonging to a running club. You don't have to have an excuse to pitch. You're there to run. But then you also socialize. So to have kind of a space where guys can just show up because they're going to be taught something, and then from there the accountability can flow. I definitely think that there's a far greater openness for that now.
I asked my husband before the show, I asked him what he does that really supports his mental health, and he does a whole lot of things right, and I thought he was going to say, that jog he does in the morning with the dogs and he's getting sunlight, and that always seems to cheer him up. And his response was quite surprising. He said that for him, it is just having vulnerable, real talk with human beings, especially men, and that does him the best.
Sure.
And, to talk about your shit, like just the hard talk, not just the easy stuff. But I agree there has to be more spaces where it's more comfortable to do it. Because if you don't feel safe to share, I think it's incredibly hard, especially if it's one-on-one. If you're looking someone in the eyes versus just if there is an environment where you can just speak if you feel called to do so.
So I want to move on to the alcohol and the social media thing. So I read in a I'm just going to read you. I read in a Harvard Business Review study that when men experience these mental feelings, they do one of 3 things. So they either escape, or they withdraw, or there's externalization. So escape meaning they go to I want to stop there with the escape. So because that's what I think I see more frequently is, where do they escape to? So you mentioned now social media. There's alcoholism. I don't think a lot of men realize that they've got an alcohol problem, because nowadays it's such an acceptable thing to arrive home after a tough days of work and pour yourself a glass of wine or have a whiskey, and before you know it, you've got a bit of a problem which you don't necessarily realize. So I want to go into that: the alcohol, social media. And then also one other thing which is also, something that a lot of men go into is pornography. So I want to address those 3 things. So let's discuss that. And Karin, if we can start on your side. I know we've had this discussion before around, teenage boys and younger men turning to pornography. What's the impact of that? And why, just from a mental point of view, why do men go to pornography as a form of escaping?
I can actually answer your question with pornography or alcohol or social media or food. In my therapeutic modality, I believe it's a lack of skill that's related to emotional regulation. So my live view is that people do the best they can with the skills they have. And if you don't have good skills, you won't be doing great, right? And along with that, I think a lot of people, men, women, both, struggle with emotional regulation. And we don't teach our children, and definitely we have not been taught emotional regulation skills. And so then you need to find something that is going to help you regulate the mood, which could be food, which could be alcohol. Obviously, alcohol is a really nice way to regulate your mood, makes you really relaxed, okay? And then I think pornography is even more effective in helping you regulate your mood because it's a reinforced experience. It's a pleasant experience for men, and maybe some exhilaration or maybe some soothing. And so this method of regulation is now constantly reinforced. So now I don't have skills to regulate differently. And then whenever I'm upset, this is what I use to regulate. And in pornography specifically, I think what happens in young people is they don't have the tools or the language, especially boys, to say, this really upset me, or I'm really disappointed that this girl didn't like me, or my dad just screamed at me because of my math marks or whatever. And so because of their high testosterone levels at that specific time in their life, they resort to masturbation or pornography, which then gives them that regulating effect. So now what happens in your brain is now those two things become connected. So now when I'm an adult, now I have a fight with my wife, I don't know how to regulate that emotion. The first connection in my brain is porn will help me. So let me go do that, or let me masturbate, and then at that point, this becomes a pattern of how I regulate emotionally. I think a large part of the answer is awareness for that, and realizing that there's actually other ways you can emotionally regulate if you teach yourself the skills.
Yeah, with far less devastating effects.
100%.
Because, pornography desexualizes people. It doesn't increase people's sexuality. It increases sexual addiction. But it doesn't increase your experience of your own sexuality. It desexualizes, and then by the time they want to enter into a healthy, beautiful, real sexual relationship with somebody, they often can't, because now for years they've taught their bodies to have sexual experiences with themselves, and we see that often. I see that often in therapy, where people eventually want to have normalized sexual relationships. And then they just can't, because for years and years and years now, you've literally taught your body, you've conditioned your body to have a very specific sexual experience. And your brain now has to learn a new one, which is very hard. And what we often see also in the Christian culture is the incredible guilt of having sexual intercourse with another person that is considered to be sinful, so they just swap that for private non-disclosure of sexual experience, and porn unfortunately provides the ideal but highly addictive context where somebody with a fully developed spirituality can be completely addicted to pornography for many years, because nobody needs to know, and it literally hijacks their sexuality in a very powerful way.
And even I think there's studies coming out on the impact that a porn addiction has on your brain, and that's terrifying stuff,
It does, and it is so common. A colleague of mine had a talk at a primary school. The boys in grade 7 were incredibly bored by the conversation, because they just said, oh, no, we're over that now. By then they are now over it.
Wow.
So at which point in your life, parents just need to realize you cannot be naive about it. If your child has a phone, and all kids have phones now, your child will be exposed to pornography. It happens within 2 seconds. unfortunately.
So, yeah, I have a bit of a different experience, perhaps unconventional. So, obviously, being a dietitian, I don't chat about porn and the porn addiction, but coming into this conversation, I knew it might be a topic that we were going to address. So, I spent some time on online forums, so Q&A forums like Quora and Reddit, and probably more time than I should have, but there was a lot of really young boys asking questions, and they were quite open and vulnerable about it being a problem. Like, they are aware and they're seeking help. And obviously, I don't think online forum is the correct place to seek help, but they were met with so much shame from, you know, men and women, but mostly for men, telling them that they are bad and somehow broken and flawed, and it was absolutely heartbreaking. I hope these kids end up find psychologists that can help them to.
Sure.
It is hard because it happens in such easy privacy that it can
Anonymous,
continue for many years before eventually, you know, it is exposed. And it's usually exposed when they enter into a relationship with someone, and suddenly your girlfriend says, "No, that's not cool. You know, that's not cool at all."
Sure.
And then some of them are truly quite surprised about it. You know, they're so socialized that it's become completely normal. It's so normalized.
Sure.
I thought it was like so interesting you said about emotional regulation, but I also learned that it's also the positive emotions that they use porn to. It's not only the losses, but also the wins that get celebrated by watching porn, which I thought was just, I mean, that was new to me, something I never knew.
And let's talk alcohol. So I think that's an interesting thing for me because it's been so normalized. I mean, I think we all know people that every day when they arrive home, there's a drink just to calm them down. Sergey, is it fine to do it? And if not, why not? What's the impact of that, the long-term impact? Because I don't think a lot of men realize what the impact of that is.
Yeah, so maybe I'll address that from two angles, if I may.
Yeah, sure.
The one is as a general practitioner. So when I see, especially men, but women also, but more so with men, exhibiting the symptoms and signs of anxiety and depression, one of the things that I do as a standard is a liver function test. And I do that because we can pick up certain enzymes that are associated to alcohol overdose. And that gives me the leverage that when I've done the liver test and it comes back usually positive, then I use that as a leverage to talk to them about the issue. It's an open door, as it were, because if I would ask them straight out, many would not, it's not a problem. It's not an issue, you know, I'm just relaxing. You know, we do it culturally, there's no problem with it. But, you know, it's starting to affect your liver, and your liver is taking strain. So that gives me that inroads. And from a spiritual point of view, I think it is replacement. So as we said, Karin told us that it's about emotional regulation. So it is another avenue that I am trying to regulate myself, but it is destructive. It's destructive on a physical level. It's destructive on an emotional level. It's destructive on an intellectual level. Alcohol affects every organ of the body. And on a spiritual level, because it shuts down relationship. You know, many times you don't have you're not present because you want to escape the situation for whatever reason. And that breaks down relationships.
Yeah, I think that the dilemma is that alcohol really works very well. So you know, it's a natural depressant. So it takes the edge off things. So if you're irritated, or if you're anxious, or if you're angry, or if you're just not feeling in touch with yourself, you know, the minute the alcohol gets to your brain and you get all those hits, you just feel fantastic. The dilemma is that it is highly addictive. So for some people, once again, genetically, they are way more prone to develop a full-blown addiction. Other people can have a glass of wine every night of their life, and they will never have more than one glass of wine. They just drink it because they enjoy it, or they'll have a whiskey and they'll be completely okay with it. Unfortunately, there are some indications whether we will be vulnerable for alcohol. You have to look at your family history. Are there alcoholics in your family? Are there people with mood disorders? In the 1970s, we didn't really know why so many people got addicted. Now we know people who have mood disorders have an extremely high chance of becoming addicted to alcohol, because it medicates your symptoms. It makes you feel better. But then you have to have more and more and more. And if you have a genetic predisposition, then unfortunately the chances of you becoming an alcoholic and losing the functionality of your life is just so incredibly high. And it is certainly not about willpower. They are just weak-willed. Why don't you just have 2 glasses of wine? Just do it. Because they can't. Because they cannot do it. So to try and get the judgment out of that is incredibly hard. And I don't know about you, but alcohol misuse by teenagers, I mean, it is rife.
Sure.
They socialized. I can remember our kids came home from school and they had a talk about alcohol at school. And my younger son, who is now a lawyer, so now he can be angry all the time, said, "You are introducing us to addiction." Because I said, guys, you have to have a glass of wine and you have to know what it feels like. And literally that was the counsel that they got at school. If your parents are allowing you to have a glass of wine, they're introducing you to addiction. So that's a very, excuse the pun, sobering thought to have. How do we introduce this behavior into the lives of people? Because at some point they are going to be exposed to it. And we just live in a culture.
Yeah.
The beautiful winelands, the rugby, the sport, it just normalizes the whole thing incredibly.
I think you made a good point to differentiate between people who struggle with alcohol and alcohol addiction or abuse, and then almost the misuse of alcohol, right? And I had a beautiful testimony from a client who said the first time I suggested not to use alcohol, he was like, she's just one of those psychologists. They all say it. She must be such a prune. I think I even got this. She's such a Christian psychologist, And at some point, he decided to stop using alcohol completely. And after about a year, he said something that I thought was really profound. He said, "It's not that alcohol ever caused any of my dysregulation or my problems. But when I started looking back, every time there was a problem, alcohol was involved." And that really made me think. And
I often challenge people. I've become far more direct about it. So if you come and see me and you are using alcohol in your life at some point, whether you're misusing or whether you're just using it, I challenge you to do an alcohol fast. To just do the experiment. Just stop using alcohol for a month or for 3 months and just journal about it. Just write down, bring me some valid data. What happens to the quality of your sleep? What happens to the quality of your exercise? What happens to the quality of your conversations with the people in your life?
How much weight are you losing?
often those empty calories that we just throw down our throats. It is just it's a really good exercise for people to do, to to just realize, but what is the function of alcohol in my life? Am I just really using the glass of wine to kind of chill out on a Saturday afternoon? Or has it become a crutch? Does it have a very specific, measurable, predictable function in my life? For me as a therapist, then question mark.
And Nina, on your side, from a nutrition point of view, do you see any correlation between that, someone drinking, and do you also give advice to some guys to fast alcohol?
Yeah, well, it's something I personally had to do recently, is do an alcohol fast. I also, like, moving to the winelands, there's such a big wine culture, and I found myself one day thinking back, and I couldn't specifically recall a day where I didn't have a glass of wine. And I didn't realize, it wasn't 3 or 4, but it was definitely 1 a day. So I definitely did do a fast, and yes, like you said, sleep improves, everything improves, which is wonderful. I definitely do consult my patients on their alcohol consumption, especially my patients that come in with a mental health diagnosis, especially anxiety, especially depression, because we know it's that vicious cycle. We know that we are consuming alcohol because we're anxious. And then what happens if we consume alcohol? Then the neurotransmitter serotonin is depleted. If that's depleted, then we become depressed. Then we're depressed, we isolate, we drink more, we become more anxious, we're anxious again, and this vicious circle just goes round and round and round. So yes, it is. Do they always listen? No. But it is definitely something we chat about, and I do always try and wiggle in some mechanism there about their gut health, because everyone, if we're consuming alcohol, then it's also having detrimental effects on our gut health, which is very important. Also not ideal for our blood sugar regulation. It really has significant biological implications.
So even that one drink a day.
Sure. Okay, so the literature is quite
I know it
tricky.
differs from...
It's tricky with red wine and white wine specifically. So there the data is a little bit more mixed, if it's 1 glass or 2 glass. But I would say the way in which we are consuming alcohol is definitely a problem.
Yeah.
So if I do see someone and they are steadfast that they're going to continue drinking, I would at least recommend, okay, then let's try rather do red or white wine. It's better, and then have it with food and really try and limit it to occasions instead of having it be like a crutch that you use.
Thanks, Nina. And as a conclusion, so we've spoken about alcohol and porn addictions. The one other thing was the social media and the impact of social media. So Johan, if you can conclude this for us, the men escaping to these things, what's the impact of social media?
I think it's really important that we understand that it is highly, highly, highly addictive. When we are busy on electronic equipment, your phone and iPad, your computer, we become neurologically addicted to it. It gives you a beautiful little rush. It makes you feel good. It grasps your attention. As with all things that we become addicted to, it's a hijacker. So we want to do more and more of it. There is an infinite amount of places that you can go to. There are so many platforms. There is no end to it. You can be on your phone for 10 minutes, or you can be on your phone for 10 years, and there will always be something new. So the entire context is overwhelmingly large, and then the content is hugely entertaining. It just makes us feel you have your best friend with you. In my home, I just refer to the phobic partner. They become phobic if the phone is not with them, and we can test it. Just take your phone and put it somewhere, and then time yourself and see how long it takes you before you think, "Where's my phone?" It influences relationships. It just kind of depletes us emotionally. We spend all our emotional energy looking at what other people are doing.
And then just all the news that's available. I was thinking of it last night. I remember when I grew up, when I was a young boy, I think there was news on, I think it was 7 a.m. in the morning and 7 a.m. in the evening, and you had your half an hour of news, and that was that. If you missed it, you missed it, and you had to buy the newspaper the next day. And now all of a sudden it's there 24 hours a day, and we've got hundreds of different news channels where we can read up on things.
It's hugely addictive. 30 years ago, if something happened in New York, we might find out about it 6 months later. Now we know it instantaneously. So of course it's highly entertaining. So for me, I think one should have technology-free time in your home. We should have technology-free zones. And everybody has to adhere to it. So as men, we need to set the example. Monkey sees, monkey does. So you can't expect your kids to not do it if you continuously do it. Firstly, to recognize that it's an addiction. When I say this to people, they kind of no.
But not only just whether it's an addiction or not. I think people kind of would even it's an addiction. But I don't think people see the problem with why it's a bad addiction, And for me, it's a thief, firstly. But the second thing is, I think it makes us a little bit dumb because there's a constant confirmation bias. The more the algorithms see what you want to read, the more you get fed only one side of a story, as opposed to proper conversations or time with people with different opinions where you can be challenged a little bit, learn to see another perspective. Now we just sit and watch the same thing over and over.
Yeah, it really is an interesting awareness that people have to come into, is to once again do a social media fast, do a technology fast. Just say, I'll keep my phone or my iPad on during work hours, and when I get home, I'll switch it off. Some people don't know how to switch off their cell phones. They don't know that it has that function. No, but what if something happens? So one of my supervisors gave me a wonderful gift many years ago. I was completely obsessed with having real-time connection with everything. And he looked at me and he said, "When did you become a brain surgeon or a fireman?" And I thought he was being sarcastic. And he said, "No, only brain surgeons that are busy with operations and firemen who are at work should be contactable all the time." And that was liberating. We kind of elevate ourselves to a place where we feel our family members and our work colleagues, we must get the email immediately. Oh, what nonsense. We don't have to get the email immediately. How does it help you? Now you go to bed with that email. So the off button and the fasting. Just see what happens when you take it away. We will all be uncomfortable.
I'm already uncomfortable just thinking about it.
It is.
Thanks, guys. Thank you very much for your time. I truly appreciate it. Thanks for sharing a whole lot of knowledge and wisdom today, and I'm sure it will really benefit all men out there. So thank you very, very much.
Great pleasure.